Did the government just approve hallucinogens for mental illness, or is that what people think happened? A new executive order involving psychedelic drugs, specifically ibogaine, has sparked excitement, confusion, and for some people, real concern. And let's be honest, many of us still remember when drugs like LSD were part of controversial government experiments decades ago. Programs like MKUltra showed us that hallucinogens were once used in ways that violated trust. Then more recently, the COVID pandemic reinforced that violation of trust. So when we hear about new government involvement with these substances, it raises important questions, and when people, including myself, hear that the government is now fast-tracking research into hallucinogenic drugs, it's not surprising that many are asking whether history could repeat itself regarding the use of unethical government experiments. That history is real and we must never forget it. I'd like to hear your thoughts, especially from those of you who lived through the LSD era or the Vietnam years. Do you think research like this should move forward, or does history make you cautious? Let me know in the comments. Before we go any further, let me explain why this subject matters to me personally. In addition to my 30 years as a pharmacist, I worked as a drug regulator and criminal investigator for the state of Florida for 13 years. In this capacity, I wrote and interpreted laws related to drugs, medical devices, cosmetics, and dietary supplements. In fact, I wrote the emergency scheduling law that made the hallucinogenic drug known as 2CB illegal in Florida. During that case, I consulted directly with Alexander Shulgin, the chemist who created 2CB and one of the foremost experts on hallucinogenic compounds. Shortly, I'm going to show you the exact wording in this executive order that mentions hallucinogenic drugs, and explain why that wording matters more than most people realize. The experts that have supported this order are Dr. Mehmet Oz, made famous by Oprah, HHS Director RFK Jr., a healthcare victim, Marty McCary, a Johns Hopkins surgeon, Brian Hubbard, ibogaine advocate, Eric So, pharmaceutical executive, and Joe Rogan, comedian and podcaster. The only two of these that have any medical expertise at all are Dr. Oz, who became rich and famous due to Oprah Winfrey, and Dr. Marty McCary. Dr. Oz has always been a concern to me because of his Oprah connection. We have always been told that some people will get deals to save their legacy, but I would be remiss if I didn't watch Oz closely and consider the possibility of infiltration into the administration. Then there's the FDA Commissioner, Dr. Marty McCary, who is much more credible in my opinion. He was a pancreatic and gastrointestinal surgeon at Johns Hopkins and openly spoke against the gender-affirming program there. While he supports expedited access to these drugs, he emphasizes that it can only be done if safety standards are maintained. This puts my mind at ease. The commissioner is ultimately the one overseeing that the data is solid and the protocol prioritizes safety. The problem is that he isn't the one directly approving these drugs. When it comes to these particular drugs, there is what's known as the Psychopharmacologic Drugs Advisory Committee, which is responsible for approval or disapproval. Trust me, guys, this approval process is behemoth and lengthy but justified when you are talking about ingesting or injecting volatile chemicals. The key to drug safety is not eliminating the FDA to allow for a free-for-all of snake oil salesmen. The key is vigilance and ethics, and that's what we lost or perhaps never had. So let's hope that Dr. McCary is capable of both. I checked the current committee members, and I am thrilled to announce that only one of them is an industry representative, and they are non-voting. This is a huge change from what I saw inside, which was heavily weighted industry members making decisions. So kudos to whoever President Trump tasked to clean up FDA. We're noticing. So let's take a look at this executive order to understand the language of the law and the surrounding announcements clarifying the intent of the law. First, HHS Director RFK Jr. posted the following on X. Under this historic executive order, HHS will accelerate research, approval, and access to new mental health treatments, including psychedelic therapies such as ibogaine. Psychedelic therapies specifically deal with mind-bending, hallucinogenic drugs. The executive order and subsequent releases specifically mentioned a drug called ibogaine, which I remember from my days in enforcement. The street name for ibogaine is iboga, which relates to the root bark of the Tabernanthe iboga plant, from which the alkaloid is derived. It's actually a traditional African name for the plant itself, used in religious ceremonies for centuries as a sacrament, stimulant, or hallucinogen. I tried it once at a seminar in Fiji. There was a big bowl of tea which we each drank from with a big spoon. As it turns out, early ibogaine experiments occurred at the Federal Addiction Research Center, inside the United States Narcotic Farm in Lexington, Kentucky, which was a prison and research facility for addicts. Its director, Harris Isbell, and others tested ibogaine, LSD, and other hallucinogens on volunteer prisoners, many of whom were addicts who received heroin or privileges in exchange for their participation. This was explicitly CIA-funded as part of the MKUltra program. The prisoners really didn't know what they were getting, and it was highly unethical. Prior programs like Project Bluebird and Artichoke, way back in the 1950s, used hallucinogens for what they called special interrogation. There were even CIA-funded experiments in Montreal, Canada, as part of a sub-project of MKUltra. So, I just want you to know that this is the history of these drugs by the government, and we must always outweigh the risk against the benefit. Let's see if the risk of this money going into such programs is actually outweighed by the benefits. Another concern and misconception that's going around is that ibogaine is a plant-based natural medicine. Even the AI is improperly labeling the drug as a natural product. And once again, I got a correction from AI. This time it was ChatGPT. The last time was Grok on thimerosal. I did a video on it that I'll link. This is an ingredient in many vaccines. So make no mistake, AI makes mistakes, and this executive order authorized pharmaceutical companies to synthetically manufacture hallucinogenic drugs legally. I confirmed that by going to the protocol in modern clinical trials for psychedelics, including those for addiction, PTSD, depression, and related conditions. Researchers almost always use synthetic preparations rather than crude herbs or whole plant material, and there's a very good reason for this. Let me explain. Many people don't realize that quite a few pharmaceuticals are actually based on substances found in nature. In fact, about a third of all FDA-approved drugs are based on naturally occurring active ingredients. Most are made completely synthetically for many reasons, but primarily because you really can't fit an appropriate dose of most plant medicines in a capsule or tablet without extraction at a minimum. Another important reason is because the FDA requires a standardization of the dose. Manufacturers must prove that they can repeatedly produce the same amount of active ingredient. Anyone that is portraying ibogaine or any other FDA-supplied hallucinogen as natural simply doesn't understand pharmaceutical design and are propagating misinformation. Plants just don't work like that. The content of all of the different chemicals in a plant is governed by many factors such as nutrients, sun, pH, and so on, and no two plants have the exact same amount of everything in them. Secondary alkaloids is another reason that I personally choose to take plants and foods for my medicine. I covered that in a different video that will be linked in the description. So, my point is that people must understand that either they want big pharma or they don't want big pharma, or maybe they want some sort of hybrid of it, which is fine because I believe there can be a medical system that encourages medicinal innovation, as long as we also provide educational resources for people to grow their own medicines safely in our kitchens. Natural treatments are suppressed because there's simply no money to be made on non-pharmaceutical remedies in a healthy population. So, that's two things that we should put on the side of concerns. We're talking about drugs that were used in mind control programs and are likely more palliative chemicals than curative. But there is a very encouraging side to this executive order that we will go over after we briefly look at a few important terms in the order. If you appreciate careful analysis like this, based on real regulatory experience and not just speculation, consider subscribing. I focus on breaking down complicated medical and government topics so you can understand what's really happening and what's not. Next, let's look at the language of the executive order. I won't read every word. I'll leave that for you with a link in the description. Instead, I'll discuss the portions of the law related to what is actually being done here. The order's name is Accelerating Medical Treatments for Serious Mental Illness. Section 1 defines serious mental illness as having a diagnosable mental, behavioral, or emotional disorder that substantially interferes with a person's life and ability to function, and encompasses 8 million people right now. In my opinion, this is really a lame definition, and could include someone who wasn't accepted to college because they were depressed. There needs to be clear guidelines and a history of failed other treatments. Hallucinogens should never be first-line treatment. The order also states that there's already clinical trials, and the FDA has designated specific psychedelics as breakthrough therapies. Once again, the term breakthrough therapies aren't really adequately defined in the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. Rather, they are described in regulatory guidance documents as intended to treat a serious or life-threatening disease or condition, and having preliminary clinical evidence indicating it may demonstrate substantial improvement over existing therapies. There's no specific list of serious or life-threatening conditions for purposes of breakthrough therapy designation or accelerated approval. We don't want to get too deep, but suffice to say that drug laws often leave many opportunities for interpretation, and that's how corruption is fueled. Section 2 of the order establishes a couple of things. It says that the FDA commissioner shall provide vouchers to appropriate breakthrough drugs. It also says that FDA shall establish a pathway for eligible patients to access these drugs under the Right to Try Act. The voucher program is a relatively new FDA initiative launched in June 2025 by FDA Commissioner Marty Makary. These vouchers don't go to patients or doctors. They go exclusively to sponsors or pharmaceutical manufacturers for a specific drug or biologic application. I know it sounds bad for FDA to be giving money to pharmaceutical manufacturers, but this isn't really a bad thing, and let me tell you why. Drug companies are in it to make money, that's no secret. If there's a condition that is rare and won't have many customers, it's not financially lucrative for them to go through the process of approval. They want the big sellers like heart and diabetes innovations, not rare neurological diseases. By paying for a company's drug application, smaller manufacturers have an opportunity to compete with the big boys, and interventions for rare diseases are researched. I am concerned, however, that these vouchers could become another money grab for Big Pharma, like people selling vouchers for favors so the house has got to be clean at FDA. Bribes are no stranger to FDA. In Part 3, the order addresses the funding. It says that HHS shall allocate $50 million from existing funds to give to state governments for programs to advance these psychedelic drugs for serious mental illness. I think of Minnesota and California, but this is a relatively limited acceleration right now. There's only 6 trials ready to go into Phase 3, so that's limited manufacturing until approval, but they need to plug the holes. Part 4 says that the FDA has to collaborate with the VA and the private sector to increase clinical trial participation, which essentially means that they are specifically targeting veterans as well as the private sector for trial participants to receive psychotropic drugs. While this is a déjà vu for me and what was done to soldiers in the past, the trials on this are pretty controlled and have the potential to greatly benefit debilitating PTSD in veterans. Section 5 says that the Attorney General has to review all Schedule I drugs that have completed Phase 3 trials for a particular serious mental health disorder. That means that he's accelerating these drug applications. Next, we want to take a look at a fact sheet released by the White House. It's clear from both this fact sheet and the order itself that it's specifically intended to prevent suicide, especially among veterans. I can confirm from my time at the VA that veterans very often suffer from severe, debilitating post-traumatic stress that makes them a threat to themselves and sometimes to others. They need help, but this may not be a cure for many who could have their condition recur. But I can see how just one trip, especially with a therapist present, can greatly help veterans resolve the experiences they had, perhaps through regression. Even Alexander Shulgin believed that psychedelics could be beneficial in mental illness, but he was very clear that controlled settings by trained therapists and careful dosing in a clinical setting was necessary. He believed misuse or reckless distribution was dangerous and regretted when compounds became widely abused. Shulgin synthesized hundreds of psychoactive compounds, and some of them later became widely abused. So these are my concerns as well. The trial is designed well, but the diversion potential for these drugs is great, especially as federal enforcement is cutting off imported supplies of drugs subject to abuse. Every point these drugs pass through is a potential source for diversion. Potential diversion at the manufacturer, the wholesaler, the pharmacy, the provider, and the patient. So the less hands it passes through, the better. Hopefully, they will go direct from the manufacturer to the doctor or clinic. Lastly, I'm going to go over the actual studies. From 2023 to 2025, there were about 257 FDA-registered psychedelic clinical trials, compared to 105 between 2007 to 2020. Only 4 or 2% of these are ibogaine trials, so I have to wonder why this particular one was called out in the law. These trials are for ibogaine to treat opioid addiction, alcohol dependence, traumatic brain injury, and PTSD in veterans. The law also specifically instructs states to find veterans, so the stimulus for this bill was that ibogaine trial for vets with PTSD. There's 2 important trials right now. Stanford Veterans Ibogaine Study, which has completed its pilot and is now moving to Phase 2. The study only had 30 participants and will now be expanded to 120 participants. The results of this early trial with those 30 patients substantially formed the foundation for this new bill. 19 of the 30 veterans had suicidal thoughts and 7 had attempted suicide at some time. The trial was conducted in Mexico, and the protocol was a single dose of ibogaine with magnesium to reduce dangerous heart rhythm issues. The results look clinically miraculous. There was an 88% reduction in PTSD symptoms and 77% cured of PTSD. The second trial on ibogaine for vets is the Texas Impact clinical trial, which is already planned and ready to go into this new accelerated FDA pathway for trials. With $50 million in funding from the state of Texas, it's the largest ibogaine trial yet. The process of creating a clinical trial is quite extensive, and you don't design trial protocols overnight, so this is really being accelerated. Apparently, this was quite a coordinated effort to make this happen. The trial is being conducted in numerous universities and hospitals across Texas, and there will be about 300 participants receiving 1 dose for PTSD, traumatic brain injury, opioid addiction, or cognitive trauma. The protocol hasn't been published, but will likely include 1 large dose of ibogaine in a hospital setting, with psychological sessions integrated into the experience. I'll put a link in the description in case you are interested in looking into these trials. The obvious next concern for a medical system skeptic like me is who is funding this study, Governor Greg Abbott signed legislation authorizing state funding, and the legislature approved matching funds. This allowed them to accept the $50 million from HHS. I didn't see any private money. I had concerns about this action, to be honest, but there's brain images showing that ibogaine makes actual physical changes in areas of the brain that are responsible for processing trauma, emotional regulation, and addiction behavior. So this is very strong evidence of potential benefit. Animal studies suggest that there's increased neurotrophic factor which supports neural repair and synaptic growth and gives promise of repairing neurons. This could be big for neurological conditions of all types in consenting individuals. On the downside, there's been about 30 to 40 deaths worldwide from ibogaine since the 1990s. Most were in inadequately controlled clinics or non-medical settings. There's 6 Phase 3 trials that the Attorney General must review according to the new law. That doesn't mean they will be approved. I am all about compassionate use for currently untreatable life-threatening illnesses. I remember that compassionate use became an issue in the early days of AIDS. The rationale was that the people were going to die pretty quick anyways, so it really couldn't hurt to take an untested or unproven drug. In this case, the benefits outweighed the risks, but I'm not sure they do with conditions like depression, which is often temporary and can be an endogenous neurotransmitter imbalance for which we do have drugs and even foods and herbs that can re-establish balance, so I'm cautious on this one. The bottom line for me is that this executive order appears to be another example of President Trump's gratitude and compassion for our military heroes. There's real concerns about diversion of these psychedelic drugs and this money, but this can be managed with ethical leadership and appropriate accountability. There also needs to be a lot of clarification here regarding which conditions this treatment can be authorized. This might be the biggest abuse if doctors are allowed too much autonomy in deciding who is eligible. We don't want to see another situation like gender-affirming care where the treatment is overused by unqualified providers. Usually rules are enacted clarifying what the law doesn't say, so hopefully they are forthcoming. The perception that psychedelic therapies suddenly appeared is misleading. The reality is they were researched heavily since the 40s, then shut down and only slowly revived. When the Controlled Substance Act was signed in 1970, psychedelic drugs were classified as Schedule I, meaning they had no medicinal use, and were highly subject to abuse. Research restarted in the late 90s due to advocate pressure. So if they've been under investigation for so long, why have they never been approved? This reason is that there's significant risk. The controlled environment minimizes it, but hallucinogens can really mess your mind up if you have a bad trip, and you can have residual flashbacks for the rest of your life. Frank Olson was a U.S. Army scientist who was secretly given LSD during MKUltra experiments. He developed severe paranoia and fell from a hotel window in New York 9 days later. His death was ruled a suicide. People under psychedelic influence have jumped from buildings trying to fly. They run into traffic trying to get away from perceived threats, and they've harmed themselves due to intense paranoia. In fact, most deaths are behavioral accidents, not toxicity. This can all be mitigated in the controlled environment. However, there are also cases of sudden cardiac arrest, coma-like states and catatonia, internal bleeding, sudden anxiety panic, and quite a few other side effects. There's also a rare condition known as hallucinogen persisting perception disorder, in which the person who used it has persistent visual trails behind moving objects, snow vision, flashbacks, and visual distortions, which makes them unable to drive or read. Another reason that psychedelic treatments haven't been approved is because there's no funding for research from the big money, because naturally occurring substances are hard to patent. It's always about money. So considering the risks, mass shootings attributed to severe PTSD have been committed by decorated veterans on several occasions. This is pretty rare, but veterans taking their own lives isn't. their actions are often uncontrollable. When I worked at the VA, we had a hospitalized Vietnam vet patient. On rounds, there was a Vietnamese team member named Kai. We hid Kai behind in the back of the group and placed the chair so the veteran's back would face the group. When he walked into the room, he immediately spotted Kai and became agitated, paranoid, and defensive. We calmed him down, but he turned the chair so he was facing Kai and never took his eyes off him. The veins jumped in his neck the whole time, from absolute fear of being in such a vulnerable situation, in his mind. So I have to say that some of these vets can't sleep, have no quality of life, and are a real danger to themselves and others. They are already living with a persistent perception disorder. When we compare the benefit to the suffering of these veterans and severe trauma victims, it appears to outweigh the risk in my mind, and this was a wise move by POTUS. It does make me consider that medbeds are further down the road than we think. This EO will accelerate the therapy, but it will likely be a few months at least. The move puzzles me but was a rational decision. This executive order may represent a turning point in how we treat the invisible wounds of war. But as always, progress must be guided by science, transparency, and careful oversight.